My name is Emma. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I was known as the dependable one, the calm one, the woman who handled things quietly so other people could move faster, speak louder, or feel more important. I was a wife, a mother, a professional with a steady role that looked ordinary from the outside. Nothing about me ever raised alarms or inspired warnings. People often describe me as easygoing or low maintenance or strong in a quiet way. What they didn't realize was how often quiet gets mistaken for invisible. I've always been the kind of person others underestimate. Not because I lacked intelligence or awareness, but because I didn't perform them. I didn't narrate my thinking out loud. I didn't escalate emotions to be heard. I believed for a long time that consistency and integrity would naturally command respect. That if I stayed grounded, things would balance themselves out. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about public humiliation, screaming matches, or dramatic exits. It's about observation, about patience, about what happens when a woman stops explaining her worth and starts measuring reality instead. What you're about to hear is the honest account of a marriage unraveling, not in flames, but in silence. It's about the moment I realized that loyalty can be one-sided, that absence can be louder than betrayal, and that sometimes the most decisive power shift happens internally, long before anyone else notices. At the center of this story is a day that was supposed to be about my child's courage. A hospital room. A procedure that required consent, trust, and presence. I was there. My husband wasn't. He said he was on a business trip, something plausible, something routine, something I didn't question at first because I had been trained over the years not to question. What followed wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a scene. It was confirmation. Quiet, administrative, undeniable confirmation that arrived through something as unromantic as hotel points. Numbers don't lie, even when people do. This story moves slowly on purpose, because that's how clarity actually arrives in real life. Not all at once, not with dramatic music swelling in the background, but in fragments. Moments you replay later and realize they were warnings. If you're expecting rage, you won't find it here. If you're looking for a woman who burns everything down, that isn't me. What you will hear is how emotional justice doesn't always come from punishment. Sometimes it comes from withdrawal, from precision, from choosing not to be the person everyone assumed you would always be. I'm sharing this not to ask for sympathy, but to document a process. One many people go through quietly, especially women who've been conditioned to hold families together at the cost of their own certainty. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently and without expectation. Have you ever felt the moment when you realized you were the only one still taking something seriously? For a long time, I was defined by how little trouble I caused. That's the easiest way to explain who I was to them. To my husband, I was solid. That was the word he used most often. Solid like furniture you don't think about unless it breaks. Solid like a schedule that runs quietly in the background. I handled logistics, appointments, school emails, family birthdays, insurance renewals. Things that don't earn gratitude because they prevent chaos rather than create visible success. At work, I was dependable. The person who remembered details others forgot. The one who stayed late without announcing it. Fixed mistakes without attaching my name, smoothed tensions so meetings ended early. I wasn't overlooked exactly. I was assumed. My competence became part of the environment, useful but not remarkable. Friends described me as low drama. My family called me the strong one. These were meant as compliments. I accepted them because I didn't yet understand the cost. When people see you as strong, they rarely check if you're tired. When they see you as calm, they assume you don't need reassurance. And I played my part well. I listened more than I spoke. I remembered conversations people forgot having with me. I noticed patterns without pointing them out. I learned early that if you don't demand space, people will happily live inside the silence you provide. My husband never thought of himself as dismissive. In his mind, our relationship worked because I didn't complicate things. He trusted me with everything that was inconvenient and shared with others what was impressive. He traveled often. He made decisions quickly. He assumed I would adjust. And I did, not because I was weak, because I believed partnership meant elasticity. Someone had to absorb the pressure, and I was good at it. I didn't keep score. I didn't weaponize memory. I told myself that love didn't need constant accounting. What I didn't realize, what I couldn't see yet, was how invisibility slowly reshapes expectation. When you always adapt, people stop imagining you might refuse. When you're always reasonable, your pain starts to look optional. There were moments, small ones, when I felt myself receding. A conversation was redirected before I finished a sentence. A decision was announced instead of being discussed. Plans changed without checking my calendar because I was flexible. None of it felt big enough to challenge, and so I didn't. That's important to understand. There was no single betrayal at the beginning, no obvious villain, just a gradual narrowing of my role. I became the one who would handle it. Handle the child when he is sick. Handle the schedule when my husband is away. Handle disappointment quietly so no one feels accused. Handle being alone in rooms where decisions had already been made elsewhere. People didn't mistreat me because they were cruel. They did it because I made it easy. And I don't say that with bitterness. I say it with clarity. At that stage of my life, I believed that being needed was the same as being valued. That if I remained indispensable, I would remain secure. I mistook consistency for safety. I thought silence was maturity. If you had asked anyone who knew us then, they would have said we were stable, functional, maybe even enviable, a couple that didn't fight much, a household that ran smoothly. But stability built on one person absorbing all the imbalance is fragile. It just takes time for the cracks to show. Back then, I didn't know I was being underestimated. I thought I was being trusted. There's a difference. And once you feel it, once you recognize which one it is, you can't unsee it. The first moment I remember wasn't dramatic. That's why it stayed with me. It happened on an ordinary weekday evening, the kind that blends into the next without leaving a mark. Dinner was half prepared. Our child was at the table coloring quietly. My husband was pacing the kitchen with his phone pressed to his ear, voice lowered, but animated. When he hung up, he didn't look at me, just reached for his keys. "I'm going to be late," he said. Not asked, stated. I remember pausing, hands still resting on the counter. I had a question ready, nothing confrontational, just practical. But before I could finish the sentence, he added, "It's important. You're fine, right?" It wasn't the words, it was the timing, the assumption that the answer was already settled. I nodded. Of course I did. That's who I was then, the one who made things easier. Later, when he came home, I mentioned, casually, that I'd hoped we could talk about a decision regarding our child's upcoming school schedule. Something small. Something that required two parents. He looked tired, annoyed maybe. He said, "Can we not do this right now? I've had a long day." That was it. That was the cut. No raised voices, no insults. Just a quiet message delivered efficiently. What mattered to me could wait. What mattered to him was urgent by default. The next morning, I replayed it in my head while packing lunches. I told myself I was overthinking, that everyone has off days. That timing is tricky. I even apologized later for bringing it up at the wrong moment. He accepted the apology without comment. What struck me, even then, was how quickly the moment disappeared for everyone else. If I mentioned it to a friend, it came out softened, edited. He was just tired. It wasn't a big deal. And people agreed. Because on the surface, it wasn't. But small moments are how patterns introduce themselves. From that point on, there were more instances like it. Plans adjusted without discussion. Decisions framed as already made. Information delivered after the fact, as if my role was to accommodate, not participate. None of it was explosive, which made it easier to ignore, and easier for others to dismiss. But I remembered the way he didn't ask, only informed. The way my concerns were treated as interruptions. The way my flexibility slowly turned into expectation. At the time, I didn't label it as disrespect. That word felt too heavy, too accusatory. Instead, I called it misalignment, stress, temporary imbalance. I believed that if I stayed calm, if I stayed reasonable, things would recalibrate. They didn't. What changed internally wasn't anger. It was awareness, a quiet note filed away in my mind. This matters more to him than we do. Not all the time. Not completely, but enough to notice. The most unsettling part was how invisible this realization was. Life continued. We laughed. We functioned. From the outside, nothing had shifted, but something had. Once you register that your presence is optional in decisions that affect you, you start listening differently. You stop assuming goodwill. You start noticing phrasing, tone, timing. That was the first small cut, not because it hurt deeply, but because it didn't heal. It sat there, unacknowledged, quietly instructing me to pay attention, and I did. After that first moment, nothing worsened in a way that was obvious. That's how normalization works. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly and rearranges what you consider acceptable. The dismissals didn't come as arguments. They came as efficiency. Conversation shortened, decisions sped up. I would hear about plans once they were already in motion. Flights booked, meetings scheduled, weekends spoken for. When I hesitated, he'd say, "I assumed you'd be okay with it." And because I had always been okay with it, the assumption sounded reasonable. I started adjusting before being asked. I learned to read his schedule and move mine around it. I delayed my needs until there was a better time. I translated my concerns into softer language so they wouldn't sound like demands. I waited until he seemed relaxed, then still sometimes decided not to bring things up at all. Each time I stayed quiet, it felt like maturity, like restraint, like choosing peace. What I didn't see yet was that I was training everyone, including myself, to believe my voice was optional. There were moments when I almost spoke up, when something in me rose and said, "This matters." But the reflex to smooth things over was faster. I told myself, "He doesn't mean it like that. This isn't worth tension." Other couples have bigger problems. And that was true. Other couples did, which made mine easy to minimize. Friends praised how chill I was. Family admired how I held everything together. Even my husband occasionally said, "I don't know how you manage all this so calmly." I took pride in that. I didn't realize that calm can become camouflage. The more I absorbed, the less visible the imbalance became. There was no single moment to point to and say, "This is where it went wrong." Just a series of small allowances that stacked neatly on top of each other until they looked like a structure. When my husband missed things, school events, doctor's check-ins, conversations that required attention, I filled in the gaps. I explained his absence in ways that protected him. "Work's just intense right now. He wishes he could be here." I made his intention sound better than his actions. I told myself that love meant understanding context. What I was really doing was normalizing being deprioritized. And once something becomes normal, it stops feeling negotiable. There were days I felt strangely lonely even when we were in the same room. Not ignored exactly, but unconsidered, as if my presence was assumed, not experienced. I would sit across from him and realize he hadn't really looked at me all evening. Still, I didn't confront him. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't yet believe the pattern was real enough to justify disruption. That's the trap of quiet disrespect. It convinces you that reacting would be an overreaction. So I stayed measured, reasonable, patient, and in doing so, I made it easier for the imbalance to continue. By the time I recognized that my silence had become part of the system, it already felt too late to simply speak up and reset everything. The roles were set. Expectations formed. I was the one who would handle it, and handling it had become synonymous with disappearing. It wasn't something anyone sat me down and explained. Roles like mine don't come with titles or ceremonies. They emerge through repetition, through what goes unquestioned long enough to become permanent. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed the disruption so others didn't have to slow down. The one who noticed what needed doing and did it before it became urgent. The one who didn't need reminders, follow-ups, or appreciation because I was just good at it. Once I saw the role clearly, I couldn't ignore how neatly everything revolved around it. My husband planned his work trips, assuming I'd manage everything at home. School forms defaulted to my email. Emergency contacts listed me first, then him, almost as an afterthought. Even our child learned early which parent to ask for what. I wasn't the fun one. I was the reliable one. Reliable sounds positive, but it has a shadow side. Reliable people are rarely consulted before decisions are made. They're informed after, because it's assumed they'll adjust. Their capacity becomes permission. Their competence becomes invisible. And I had reinforced this unintentionally over the years. I didn't push back when my needs were postponed. I didn't insist on shared responsibility in visible ways. I didn't demand recalibration when things felt uneven. I told myself that partnership didn't require constant negotiation. What it required apparently was me. There was a moment, quiet, forgettable to anyone else, when this became undeniable. My husband mentioned an upcoming commitment, already scheduled, already agreed to. It conflicted with something I'd been planning carefully around our child's needs. When I pointed it out gently, he said, "I didn't think it would be an issue. You usually handle these things." These things. That phrase landed differently. It wasn't dismissive in tone. It was casual, confident, as if my role was so established it didn't need explanation. I remember nodding again, but inside something clicked into place. Not anger. Recognition. This wasn't temporary. This was structural. I had been assigned a role, and everyone was benefiting from it, including me, in ways that had once felt meaningful. Being needed gave me identity. Being the one who handled it made me feel indispensable. But indispensability isn't the same as respect, and respect can't exist where one person's absence is tolerated without question. I started noticing how rarely my presence was considered in advance. How often were my contributions framed as background support rather than shared responsibility? How my emotional labor was invisible because it was uninterrupted. No one was trying to hurt me, but no one was protecting me either. And that's when I understood something uncomfortable. If I didn't change my position, nothing else would change around me. Still, I didn't act, not yet. Seeing the role doesn't automatically give you the strength to leave it, especially when leaving feels like abandoning the very system you've been praised for sustaining. So I stayed. I watched. I learned. I stopped assuming things would rebalance on their own. And in that shift, from trust to observation, the story truly began. The day something shifted didn't announce itself as important. There was no argument, no discovery, no dramatic realization that split my life into before and after. It was a pause long enough for me to hear my own thoughts clearly. It happened in a hospital hallway, weeks before the surgery, before the absence, before the confirmation. Our child had a minor appointment, routine but still nerve-wracking in the way only parents understand. The fluorescent lights hummed softly. A television murmured in the corner. I sat alone with a clipboard balanced on my knees, answering questions I'd answered 100 times before. Emergency contact, insurance, consent, all me. I remember signing my name and realizing I hadn't checked whether my husband was even aware of the appointment's details. Not because he didn't care, but because I'd stopped expecting him to carry that information. That was the pause. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. I saw, in that quiet hallway, how thoroughly I had become the default, how fully the system leaned on me, and how little of that load was visible unless I chose to set it down. For the first time, I didn't rush to justify it. I didn't tell myself he was busy, or that this was just how families worked. I didn't frame it as temporary or situational. I simply observed the reality as it was without softening the edges. I was alone in moments that required two people, and that wasn't an accident. What shifted wasn't my behavior outwardly. I still showed up, still handled things, still spoke calmly when needed. But internally, I stopped narrating excuses. I stopped protecting the story of us from the truth of us. There's a specific kind of clarity that arrives when you stop asking why and start asking what is. It doesn't come with adrenaline, it comes with stillness. That day, I decided, quietly, that I would no longer fill in gaps with optimism. I would no longer assume intent where effort was absent. I would stop explaining my own marginalization to myself as a misunderstanding. I didn't tell anyone this, not my husband, not my friends, not even myself in words. But something fundamental changed. I stopped volunteering my emotional labor automatically. I still gave it, but deliberately. I started paying attention to what happened when I didn't rush ahead, when I waited, when I let silence sit. And what I noticed was subtle but revealing. Things didn't fall apart. They just stalled. Questions went unanswered. Decisions were delayed. Small frictions appeared that had previously been smoothed over by my anticipation. No one connected this to me. They just felt vaguely inconvenienced. That was another revelation. My absence, even partial, even temporary, created friction, which meant my presence had been carrying more than I'd acknowledged. And for the first time, I didn't rush to restore balance. I let it be uneven, not out of spite, out of curiosity. I wanted to see the system without my constant adjustment. That day in the hospital hallway, I understood something that had eluded me for years. Silence doesn't have to mean endurance. It can mean observation, preparation, choice. I wasn't planning anything yet. I wasn't plotting an exit or a confrontation. I was simply allowing myself to stop performing reliability as identity. And once you stop performing, you start seeing. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else. My husband didn't notice a change. Our lives looked the same from the outside. But internally, I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I had moved from participation to awareness. And awareness, once established, is irreversible. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reflexive, something I used to avoid conflict, to keep things moving smoothly. Now it was deliberate. I still didn't announce it. I didn't make declarations or set boundaries out loud. I simply stopped filling every gap the moment it appeared. I waited. When my husband mentioned plans vaguely, I didn't rush to organize around them. When details were missing, I let them remain missing. When questions arose that I would normally anticipate and answer before they were asked, I let them linger. No one accused me of anything. No one even noticed right away. They just assumed I was tired, distracted, still handling it, just more quietly. That assumption worked in my favor. Silence, when people are used to your compliance, doesn't register as resistance. It reads as patience, or absence of opinion, or strength. My husband mistook it for the same calm I'd always had. He didn't realize that calm had stopped being accommodating and started being evaluative. I watched how often he filled the space with his own interpretations. If I didn't respond immediately, he assumed agreement. If I didn't ask questions, he assumed there were none. That told me everything I needed to know about how he perceived me, not as a partner requiring consent, but as a constant. I also noticed how quickly people grow uncomfortable when the person who usually absorbs tension stops doing so. Small inconveniences felt bigger. Decisions felt heavier. Not because anything had changed externally, but because the invisible support had paused. Still, I didn't correct the imbalance. I let it reveal itself. This wasn't punishment, it was data. I needed to understand the system clearly before I could decide what to do within it. There were moments when my husband seemed vaguely unsettled. He'd ask, "Everything okay?" in a tone that suggested he was sensing a shift but couldn't locate it. I'd answer honestly, "I'm fine." And I was. Not fine as in content. Fine as in composed. Fine, as in no longer destabilized by things that once unsettled me. The absence of reaction made him comfortable. He didn't push. He didn't probe. He returned to his routines. That too was information. Silence had always been interpreted as agreement. Now it functioned as a cover. Behind that silence, I was observing patterns more clearly than ever. Travel frequency, communication gaps, emotional availability. The way explanations were offered was preemptively for some things and not at all for others. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't dramatize. I noted. I also noticed how much freedom silence gave me. Without constant emotional output, my energy shifted inward. I slept better. I thought more clearly. I felt steadier. People often assume that speaking up is power. But sometimes withholding a response is more revealing. It shows you exactly who is comfortable with your quiet and who depends on it. My husband depended on it, and because he did, he never questioned what it concealed. I didn't yet know where this would lead. I wasn't planning an outcome. I was simply no longer willing to be the only one maintaining equilibrium. Silence became my choice, and in that choice, I reclaimed something I hadn't realized I'd given away. Control over my own attention. What they never noticed was how much space silence creates when it's no longer filled with appeasement. When I stopped rushing to respond, I gained time. When I stopped explaining, I gained clarity. And when I stopped smoothing over inconsistencies, I began to see the structure underneath our life. How it functioned, who it favored, and where the pressure points were. I didn't announce a new phase. I didn't even name it to myself. I simply began paying attention with intention. I noticed timelines, travel patterns, when trips were scheduled, how quickly they appeared, how loosely they were explained. I noticed which details were volunteered and which had to be asked for. and which questions subtly redirected the conversation. I noticed how often work functioned as an answer without content. I noticed money, not in a suspicious way, in a practical one. I reviewed statements I'd always trusted. I didn't hunt. I organized. I categorized recurring expenses, loyalty programs, and reimbursements. I learned which accounts auto-synced and which required manual updates. I understood where visibility ended. I noticed communication rhythms, the days he checked in more than usual, the days he went quiet early, the language he used when he was relaxed versus when he was preoccupied. None of it meant anything on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. This is important. I wasn't looking for betrayal. I was looking for alignment. I wanted to know whether the life I was maintaining was the same life he was living. I also started documenting, not emotionally but factually, dates, times, statements, confirmations. I kept my slim leather notebook where it had always been, tucked into a drawer, unremarkable. It wasn't evidence yet. It was context, a record of reality without interpretation. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this, not because it was secretive, but because it didn't need witnesses. People often think preparation looks like plotting. It doesn't. It looks like patience. It looks like listening without reacting. It looks like noticing what others assume will go unnoticed. At the same time, I positioned myself quietly. I made sure I understood our legal and financial landscape, not to act, but to know. I updated my own access. I refreshed my awareness of policies, contacts, and procedures, not because I planned to leave, but because I refused to be uninformed. I also recalibrated emotionally. I stopped confiding in people who reflexively minimize my concerns. I chose neutrality over reassurance. I learned how to sit with uncertainty without trying to resolve it prematurely. This part is difficult to explain to people who believe that trust means not looking too closely. For me, trust had begun to mean clarity, and clarity requires attention. My husband didn't notice any of this. From his perspective, things were fine. I was calm, cooperative, not demanding explanations, not asking for reassurance. If anything, I seemed easier to be around. That too was data. If my quiet benefited him, then my earlier concerns had never been the problem. I also noticed how rarely anyone asked me how I was. Really. Not because they didn't care, but because my composure signaled self-sufficiency. People mirror what you present. So I presented steadiness. Inside, I was assembling a map. Not to escape, but to understand the terrain fully before deciding where to stand. There's a moment when you stop explaining and start observing, when the world begins to show you exactly how it works. Not how it claims to work, not how it should. How does it do? That's what they never noticed. While they assumed continuity, I was gathering coherence. While they moved freely, confident in my silence, I was learning where the doors were and which ones were already open. I still didn't know what I would do with what I was learning, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, I would not be surprised. The reveal didn't arrive with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where my hands shook or my breath caught. It came the way truth often does when you've already prepared yourself for it. Quietly, administratively, without emotion attached. It was an ordinary evening. Our child was asleep. The house had settled into its familiar hush. My husband was away on what he'd described as another short business trip. Nothing unusual, no red flags on the surface. I was organizing receipts. That was all. I had gotten into the habit of reconciling monthly statements myself. Not out of suspicion, but out of order. When systems are clear, they feel calmer. I opened the account that tracked travel rewards, hotel points, a program we'd signed up for years ago because it made sense. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I was aligning dates. That's when I noticed the discrepancy. Points redeemed during a window that didn't match the itinerary he'd shared with me. A hotel category that didn't align with his usual preferences. A location that wasn't near the conference center he'd mentioned in passing. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because I was confused, but because I was precise. I cross-referenced, slowly, without assumption. The dates matched the surgery, our child's surgery, the one he'd said he couldn't attend because of work. The one where I sat in the waiting room alone, signing consent forms, managing fear quietly so our child wouldn't feel it. The confirmation didn't feel like a blow. It felt like alignment. Everything I'd been observing, every pattern, every absence, every assumption, clicked into place without resistance. There was no denial to push through, because I hadn't been protecting a fantasy. I had been preparing for reality. I didn't cry. I didn't confront him. I closed the laptop and sat there, letting the information settle without assigning it emotion yet. This is important. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the timing, the choice. The fact that while I was being the parent, the stabilizer, the reliable one, he was elsewhere, spending shared resources on a shared deception. And still I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't neglect. It was a decision made possible by how replaceable he believed my presence was. That realization stripped away the last layer of uncertainty. I took notes, not about feelings but facts. Dates, redemptions, locations. I didn't dramatize the discovery. I documented it. Then I closed the notebook. I slept. The next morning I made breakfast. I packed lunches. I moved through the day exactly as I always had. No one noticed. Inside, though, the story had resolved itself. There would be no impulsive confrontation, no demand for an explanation that would inevitably become a negotiation, no performance of pain that could be reframed as an overreaction. I had what I needed, not leverage in the sense of control, but leverage in the sense of truth. Verified, quiet, irrefutable. And I understood something then that I hadn't before. Emotional justice doesn't require exposure. It requires positioning. The reveal didn't push me to act immediately. It freed me from hesitation. I no longer wondered if I was imagining things. I no longer questioned whether my silence had been misread. I no longer felt the need to explain my presence into importance. The life I was maintaining was not the life we were sharing, and now I could decide what to do with that knowledge, without urgency, without spectacle, and without asking for permission. Once you know something with certainty, the noise falls away. There's a moment after clarity arrives when you're tempted to act immediately, not because you're ready, but because action feels like relief. I felt that impulse briefly, the urge to confront, to demand answers, to force the truth into the open so it could be dealt with. But urgency would have served him, not me. So I slowed down. I laid out my options the way I'd learned to lay out projects at work, without emotion attached, without moral framing. Just paths, consequences, permanence. I could confront him immediately. That would give him control over the narrative. He could explain, minimize, or redirect. He could apologize convincingly. He was good at that. Not maliciously, just fluently. I could pretend I didn't know. Continue observing. That would preserve stability, but at the cost of integrity. I would be maintaining a life built on information asymmetry, and I already knew what that did to me. I could leave quietly, begin dismantling the structure without explanation. That would protect my emotional bandwidth, but it would also transfer confusion to my child before I'd prepared the ground. There was only one option that aligned with my values. I chose the irreversible one. Not dramatic, not immediate, but finally. I decided I would not reveal what I knew until I had repositioned myself fully. Legally, financially, emotionally. I would not weaponize the truth. I would anchor it. This wasn't about winning. It was about exiting a role that required my silence to function. I didn't announce the decision. I didn't write it down. But from that moment on, everything I did was guided by it. I stopped negotiating internally. I stopped asking myself if I was being fair. Fairness requires mutual regard. What I was doing now required self-respect. I also stopped hoping. Hope had kept me pliable. Hope had softened the edges of reality. I released it, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. From the outside, nothing changed. From the inside, everything had. I moved with intention. I conserved energy. I spoke only when necessary. I listened more than ever, not to understand him, but to ensure I wasn't missing anything relevant. This decision wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by clarity, and clarity doesn't rush. It waits until the structure can no longer rely on you to hold it up. Once the decision was made, the pace of my life changed, but not its appearance. That's the advantage of moving in silence. When people expect continuity, they don't scrutinize consistency. They assume what they've always assumed, that you'll handle it. So I did, just differently. I began with structure. I consulted a lawyer quietly, during lunch breaks, framing my questions as hypothetical. I wasn't emotional, I was precise. I asked about custody frameworks, financial division, and documentation requirements. I didn't ask what to do, I asked what mattered. Knowledge, I learned, is calming. I organized my own finances, not in secret, but with intention. I ensured access. I clarified ownership. I documented contributions. Years of being the reliable one had left a paper trail I hadn't fully appreciated until I reviewed it. I didn't drain accounts. I didn't hide assets. I simply made sure I wasn't dependent on goodwill. I also shifted emotionally at home. I stopped overfunctioning. I still cared for our child fully, but I stopped compensating for his absences in ways that protected his image. If he wasn't available, I stated that plainly. Not critically, factually. I didn't inform him of everything anymore. I informed him of what he asked. This was subtle, almost imperceptible. He didn't notice because nothing broke. That's the thing about systems built on invisible labor. They don't recognize withdrawal until the effect accumulates. I also prepared our child gently, not with explanations, but with stability. I reinforced routines. I ensured emotional safety. I made sure there was no sense of instability before it was necessary. There was no rush. Time was on my side now. The truth existed, documented, anchored. I didn't need to repeat it to keep it real. My husband continued his routines, traveled, checked in occasionally, trusted that I was still the constant, and I was, just no longer at my own expense. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means not announcing changes before they're irreversible. Every step I took was aligned with one goal, ensuring that when the truth surfaced, it would land on solid ground. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was planning an ending. Consequences rarely arrive the way people expect. There were no explosions, no accusations, no sudden collapse of daily life. Instead, the consequences unfolded like a slow change in air pressure, subtle enough that no one could point to the exact moment it became hard to breathe, but undeniable once it did. At first, it showed up as an inconvenience. My husband missed a school email because I didn't forward it immediately. Not out of spite. I simply assumed, as he often had with me, that he could check himself. When the deadline passed, he sounded irritated and confused. "I didn't know about this," he said. I answered calmly. "It was in the portal." That was all. He adjusted. Or rather, he assumed I would next time.
video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.